What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to break down the increasingly common argument that cisgender is a slur and explain why that's not the case. Before I get into the cis is a slur argument itself, I want to set some important context around the word cisgender. Cis and trans are Latin prefixes. When translated into English, cis means on the side of, or on this side of, or on the same side as, and trans means on the other side of, or on the opposite side as, or beyond. It's much more common to hear cis and trans as a pair of prefixes in scientific contexts than in everyday life. But we do see trans used as a prefix all the time in many more contexts besides scientific ones. It's been built into lots of words to indicate going across or going to the other side of. For example, translation means taking words from one language and putting them into another. Transposing means taking music from one key and putting it into another. Transatlantic flights go across the Atlantic Ocean from one side to the other, etc. You can probably think of a bunch more examples yourself. When it comes to gender, including both gender identity and gender expression, we've seen the prefix trans pop up in various words over the years too, such as transvestite, meaning someone who cross-dresses or wears clothes typically associated with a gender other than their own. This term has largely become outdated, though there are still some people who find it useful to describe the way they express their gender through their clothing and style. Transsexual, meaning someone who has physically changed their body's primary and or secondary sex characteristics to affirm their gender. Much like transvestite, the term transsexual has also largely become outdated, though again there are still some people who find it useful to describe the path their transitions have taken. And finally, transgender, meaning someone whose gender is different from the gender they were assigned or assumed to be at birth. Out of these three trans-related terms, transgender is the one that's currently in most widespread use, and it's generally considered to be the most respectful and inclusive, and therefore the safest to use as an umbrella term for our community. And anyone whose true innate sense of gender doesn't match the gender they were assigned is welcome to use it, including binary men and women as well as non-binary people. Though not everyone who meets the definition of transgender chooses to adopt that label, and that's totally okay. For many years, we used terms like transvestite, transsexual, and transgender to discuss gender and gender expression without having any equivalent words that began with the prefix of cis. But that changed in 1994, when Dana DeFosse coined the term cisgender in a post on alt.transgender while working on a paper about the health of trans adolescents. It took a while to gain traction, but cisgender was finally entered into the Oxford English Dictionary and the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in 2016, as it was coming into more widespread use in society around that time frame. As you might guess, if transgender means that your gender doesn't align with the one you were assigned at birth, cisgender means that your gender does align with the one you were assigned at birth. It just means you're not trans, basically. So why do we now have people saying that cisgender, or even just the prefix of cis when referring to gender, is a slur? Why has there been so much recent pushback against it? That pushback includes arguments like, don't put a label onto me that I don't use myself. This is actually a point that a lot of queer people make when it comes to the use of labels. Let's say someone is bi, but other people call him a gay man because he happens to have a same-gender partner. In that case, he might push back and say, don't put the label of gay onto me, the label I use for myself is bi. Labeling other people instead of respecting the labels they use for themselves is considered a form of identity policing, and it's not generally something that people enjoy. But when people say, don't label me as cisgender, and you ask them what label they would rather you use instead, they move on to the next argument, which is, I don't need a label, I'm just a man, or just a woman, or just normal. Which really says the quiet part out loud, doesn't it? You're a freak, so you need a label, but I'm normal, so I don't. There's another form of pushback against the word cisgender that goes something like, if you want me to respect your pronouns, then you need to respect the fact that I don't want to be called cis. And this one is a false equivalence. Being described as cis or trans isn't the same thing as being gendered correctly. Using the right name and pronouns and other gender terms for people is something you should do all the time in all contexts if you want to meet a bare minimum of basic human respect and decency. But labels like trans and cis are contextual. They're something you only bring up if it's relevant to the discussion you're having. For example, if you're talking about how cis women and trans women face misogyny in different ways, or if you're talking about how the patriarchy relates to cis men versus trans men, then it's important to be able to make that distinction between cis and trans people. Outside of discussions like that, there's no real need to use the labels of trans and cis, and most people generally don't. So to equate respecting pronouns with respecting not calling someone cis doesn't even make sense. The only way that argument would make sense is if it went more like, if you want me to respect your pronouns, then you need to respect mine. Or, I don't want to be called cis, so therefore I won't call you trans. But of course, the people making these arguments never stopped to think logically about what they were saying. They just bristled at being called cis because the word cisgender forced them to acknowledge that trans people are just as normal as they are. And this eventually escalated into the mistaken idea that cis is a slur. Since I came out as trans, I've seen all kinds of people, from anonymous keyboard warriors to world-famous celebrities, make the claim that cis is a slur. But it really came to a head on June 21st, 2023. Seriously, why does all the transphobic stuff have to happen during Pride Month? When Elon Musk, who had recently acquired Twitter in the fall of 2022, tweeted that the words cis or cisgender are considered slurs on this platform. After that, the cis is a slur arguments exploded. There was a massive uptick. And what's so frustrating about seeing something like this happen is I make a lot of videos designed to help people who don't know much about the queer community and might be on the fence about how they feel about us, learn to understand us better and see us as human. And I don't want them to have a knee-jerk reaction when I use a word like cis that is a totally harmless adjective, but that they now think is a slur because that's what so many people are saying. At the same time, I don't want to shy away from using the word cis in my videos because it's a useful and important term when talking about trans rights and trans issues, and we need it. I remember the days when cisgender was not yet in widespread use, and back then, if we needed to make a distinction between those who were trans and those who were not, if people were trying to be the most respectful about it that they could be, they would say something like trans women versus biological women, or trans men versus biological men, which we now know doesn't make sense. Trans people are still biological humans. We don't transition into robots, right? And if people didn't care about being respectful, they might say something like trans men versus normal men. Remember that argument from earlier about how we don't need a label, we're just normal. Or even worse, they would say something like trans women versus real women, which is just completely dehumanizing. Before we had the word cisgender, we didn't have a word for not transgender that actually worked. All the words we had, biological, normal, real, were disrespectful of trans people in some way. They were othering. They were dismissive. They framed everyone who wasn't trans as the default and everyone who was trans as the odd ones out. Until cisgender came along and finally put us all on a level playing field. And that is why we need it. If we stop using cisgender because it's a slur, then what other word are we supposed to use for people who aren't trans without going back to one of those inherently harmful words that we used before? The real issue is that people who say cis is a slur don't want to be put on a level playing field with trans people. They don't want language that normalizes trans people's existence. But the reality is, cis isn't a slur, it's just a neutral descriptor. The only way you could make the case that cis is a slur is if you make the case that trans is a slur as well. I have seen some trans people respond to arguments like, "Don't call me cis, I'm just a woman," by saying, "Well, then don't call me trans, I'm just a woman too." And while I think that's a great comeback and it makes a very valid point that trans and cis are unnecessary descriptors in most contexts, it doesn't solve the problem for those times when we do need to make a distinction between those who are trans and those who are not. I've also seen some people ask, why don't we just start saying trans and not trans rather than trans and cis? And I think the answer to that largely boils down to two things. One, ease of use. Cis is more concise than not trans, and cis makes more sense linguistically when used alongside trans as a pair of Latin prefixes. And two, it's generally considered more polite to use words that describe who people are rather than who they're not. So saying cis instead of not trans is actually an attempt to be more respectful. This also brings up some interesting thoughts about the word non-binary and how it's far from perfect in that sense, but that's a subject for a whole other video. I can't help but wonder if someday we'll end up adopting not trans in place of cis simply because of all the controversy that's come to surround the word cisgender, and I sincerely hope that's not what happens, because I think cisgender is a super useful word, and I would like to see us manage to hang on to it until, of course, some new language comes along for talking about gender that's even better than anything we've had before. Language is changing all the time, so that's bound to happen someday. But for now, here is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on the word cisgender? Or about the words we used for people who aren't trans before the word cisgender was coined? How do you feel about the way the use of cisgender has evolved and the controversy around it now? How would you like to see the words we use to talk about gender change over time? And what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. If you want to reach out to me on other social media, I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. I hope this gave you something to think about, and I will see you on the next one.